Welcome back to Set Free Single Mum. This channel exists to encourage women through the truth of scripture and the gospel of Jesus Christ. Today, for our first official video, we're going to look at what scripture shows us about single mothers and God's providence in difficult circumstances. In the very first book of the Bible, we have one of the clearest examples in scripture, and that is Hagar. Hagar was sent away into the wilderness with her son Ishmael. Now, from a human perspective, her situation looked like abandonment. She had no protection, no security, no clear future, but the Bible tells us that God saw her. In Genesis 16, Hagar calls the Lord El Roi, the God who sees. This moment reminds us that God's providence extends even into the wilderness. Nothing about Hagar's situation surprised God. Nothing fell outside of his plan. And the same is true for believers today. Another powerful example is the widow who met Elijah. This woman was preparing what she had thought would be the last meal for herself and her son. Famine had stripped her life down to almost nothing. Yet God used this moment to reveal his power. Through the prophet Elijah, the Lord promised that her flour and oil would not run out. And scripture tells us that God kept his word, as he always does. Day after day, meal after meal. This story reminds us that God's provision does not always come before our need. Often, it comes exactly when we need it. All throughout scripture, God reveals his concern for the vulnerable. He describes himself as a father to the fatherless, a defender of widows, and we can find that truth in Psalm 68. However, the ultimate demonstration of God's care is not simply temporary provision. It is the gospel itself, because the greatest need that any person has is not financial stability. It is reconciliation with God through Jesus Christ. Now, if you're raising children alone as a believer, your calling remains the same as every other Christian parent: to raise your children in the fear of the Lord, to trust God's providence even when the future feels uncertain, and to rest in the finished work of Christ, because our hope is not found in perfect circumstances. Our hope is found in the sovereign grace of God. The stories of scripture remind us that God often works most clearly in the hardest places: the wilderness, the famine, the seasons of uncertainty. But the same God who sustained his people then still rules over all things today. And the same gospel that saves sinners sustains weary believers. Thank you for watching, and until next time, Soli Deo Gloria.